All right, well, welcome back to Beginning with the Basics. We're actually going to be in Genesis this time. So our third week, we're finally getting to the book of the Bible I said we were going to get to. So we're going to be in Genesis, and we're going to be looking at Genesis 1. We're going to just focus on the first few verses here because there's a very important question here. Now, verses 1 through 5 is the first day of creation. And it talks about how God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This is all the first day. And he said the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. And he called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And then it ends with there was evening and there was morning the first day. Now, what I want to focus on today is that word, day, because that is one of the most important questions for Genesis 1:1. Now, when we look at creation, when we look at the creation story, there's a few different views that people have on creation. And this is where the question of the day comes in here. Now, there's three big ones, and the three big ones can have some small different divisions in them. But the first one is called long day creation. And what this is saying is that the day here is not a literal day. It's a figurative day where it's an extended period of time. And what's saying is each day can really be thousands or millions of years. And, that's how God created things. The second one is called gap theory. And this was probably more popular about like 20 years ago. I heard it a lot back then. Many of you may have not heard of it, but I've heard it a few times still recently. And what gap theory says is, it actually says the days are literal days, but that there's a phrase there where it says in verse 2, the earth was without form and void. The word was there can actually be translated became sometimes. And so what the gap theory was saying is there's a gap between the creations of the heavens and the earth and day one. And what it's saying is that there was something going on before the actual day. And so it's called gap theory because it's a gap. And the third big view is just what we call six-day creation. Creation started on day one and it ended 6 days later with God resting on the seventh day. And this takes the idea that's just literally what it's saying there, and that the earth was created approximately, depending on who you talk to, between about 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. Now, there's a lot of things we can bring in on this conversation, but what do we use to determine which view is right? Well, like we were talking about the last few weeks, the first thing we need to do is we need to use the Bible to interpret the Bible. And that comes first. And this is where it becomes tough for a lot of people because that comes first and science and other human endeavors have to come second. Now, when I say this, I'm not saying that we are science deniers. I'm not a science denier. I love science. I teach science. I enjoy learning about so much about this world. But what we do have to ask is what can science actually prove and what scientific evidence has to be interpreted. And so when we're looking at something like this in the past, this is not something we can observe. This is not something we can reproduce. And those are two of the big tenets when you talk about the scientific method and scientific experiments. The two biggest things are, can we observe it directly and can we reproduce this? Well, obviously, the only one who was there at creation was God himself, so none of us humans observed it. And second, none of us can create anything from nothing. So this is not something we can reproduce. So when we're looking back at the past, what science has to do, what anyone has to do looking back at the past, is gather evidence and look what that evidence points to. And this can cause some problems when we have an incomplete picture. And if we have an incomplete picture, we might view something as, oh, this is what likely happened. And one of the problems with science is when we have a viewpoint of some sort there, once it gets traction, it's often tough to derail. So even if you come up with better evidence later, one of the things with science is it can lead to some circular thinking. We look at something and at one point we assumed it's true, okay? So any evidence that comes after that is interpreted assuming that that idea is already true. And that can lead to some circular evidence. You're saying, I assume this is true, and so this evidence must mean this, which will mean that this is true. It's a circular evidence here. And it can get reinforced with that circular evidence. Idea A is assumed to be true. We look at the evidence, assuming A is true, then it reinforces idea A. Now, I'm going to talk about a topic that is a very heated topic, a very common topic too, but one people don't really like to think about too much. But Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution started with the idea that cells in our bodies, in creatures, are very simple. Darwin, when he first looked at creatures and with microscopes, he couldn't see the inner workings of a cell. So he thought that the cells were simple objects that can, change themselves slightly as they split and grew into new cells. But now, we know that cells are way more complex than he could have ever imagined. If you look at just what we've learned in the last 30 years, it is a huge mountain of evidence of how complex the cell is. In the human body, there are over 20,000 different kinds of proteins. Each of these proteins are made up of strings of molecules called amino acids, and they get chained together by our body. Some proteins are very small, just a couple dozen amino acids. Others are huge. The largest known protein is called titin, and it contains over 30,000 amino acids that are stringed together in a chain. Now, these proteins have to work in a way that they have to work in a way where they get stringed together, and our body has a system to string these amino acids together. I'm not going to get too much into it, but the DNA, we make a copy of the DNA. The DNA tells us how to string these protein blocks or these amino acids together into a working protein. And once we make this string of amino acids, they actually will fold in on themselves using, again, you have to look at how chemistry works, and it's amazing, but they'll fold into themselves to make a structure that can form building blocks for the cell, that can serve different specific functions for the cell. Many of these proteins have certain locations which other molecules can bind to. And they allow these structures to be built on each other. So one protein will bind to another protein and build these large structures in this huge fashion. And others, their binding spots allow these reactions to happen more quickly because these particles are attracted to these spots and then they can be chemically reacted. And it's important because most of those reactions would not happen normally in a time frame, or a fast enough way, I should say, to sustain our bodies. Now, these proteins will cease to function if only just a single amino acid is wrong. Like if our body is making this protein and there is one mistake anywhere on this chain, more than 99.99% of the time, that protein doesn't work. Sometimes it even goes the other way, where these proteins can actually be changed into something that will harm the cell instead of help. But here's where we talk about Darwinian evolution. Here's where this comes in. Darwinian evolution requires these amino acids to change, because that's what it says. It says that these small changes will change the cell and change the function of the cell and change the organism. But if these small changes actually harm the cell instead of help, then how will that work? Now, if you look at that, the evolutionists will say, well, we can have multiple changes at the same time. And the question is, how likely is that to happen? To get from one viable protein to another requires several changes to happen at once, all in the precise location where they are needed. Now, the human body and actually all living organisms share 21 different amino acids, okay? And so we'd have to have one amino acid removed and one of the correct 20 others to be put in there in several different locations. And when you start thinking about these numbers, I'm a math guy too, so I like to think about these numbers. If you think about these numbers, if you have a protein that's 100 amino acids long, getting the right 10 or 20 amino acids to change in the exact right spot to the exact right new amino acids is highly unlikely. Okay, you're talking on the order of beyond, 1 in quadrillions, sextillions, septillions, all those huge numbers. So it's very unlikely. Now again, the evolutionists will say, well, we had millions of years and all these creatures. But if you think about the number of changes that would have to happen for these proteins to evolve into new proteins and evolve enough times to get new different types of organisms, then even billions of years and even quadrillions of creatures alive at the same time is not enough to make these changes happen. And I can go on and on about this. This is something that in my odd self, I actually, love to learn more about, but it gets technical, so I'm going to kind of stop here. But what I will say is there's lots of videos out there on some of these ideas. And if you want to know a few, you can watch them, but you let me know, I'll let you know. But they do get a little technical. If you want to read a book, one of the books that I can recommend, it's actually one of the first books to tackle this idea. It's called Darwin's Black Box. And it came into the idea of this complexity of the cell. How could it actually come around? And the cell being, for Darwin, a black box he couldn't see inside. So now, I do want to talk about, okay, I said I wasn't going to get more into this, but I want to talk about one protein, because again, this is the stuff I love. There's a protein in your body called kinesin, and I just learned about it probably in the last 4 months, and so it's just an amazing thing. And this protein literally has this structure where it can attach to other parts of your cell, like parts that need to get moved around, and has these little twin stalks. And down at the bottom, it has 2 parts that are literally like feet, and it can actually walk down your cell. And this protein, kinesin, is about 900 amino acids long. So again, this is this chain of 900 amino acids that fold up into this structure. And just getting one of those wrong would destroy the structure. And again, it can walk down parts of your cell. Like it has 2 little feet that, as they bind to different things, they move. And it can walk certain parts of your cell, like mitochondria or something else, to other parts of that cell where it needs to go. And this isn't even the most complex thing in your cell. So where does evolution stand on that? Now, again, we could bring these up, but you talk to people in science, scientists or teachers or whatnot, and they say there's already this other body of evidence for it, so this still must be true. Even though when you actually look at that body of evidence, the basis of it is no longer there. The basis of it, this idea that cells were simple, that they could change easily, it's no longer there, but yet these people will still hold to this, okay? So anyways, what I'm trying to get across here, Darwinian evolution doesn't work with our modern understanding of the cell, okay? But the idea still has momentum. And this is why we must not look at science and say, well, science equals fact. Because science is about people trying to discover things about their universe. And good and bad, sometimes it's just the popular opinion of the scientist that comes out. And 2, the second thing, God made our bodies far more complex and well-designed than we could ever imagine. I mean, could you imagine God in his infinite creativity just thinking about how he wants parts of our cell to move from one section to another, and he designed these different proteins that walk down parts of our cells? Just crazy to think about. And again, most of this understanding we just learned in the last 20 or 30 years. The cell is starting to open up to us, and it's causing problems for people who hold to evolution. Okay, but anyways, that all being said, why we have to be careful about trusting science and why we have to look at the Bible first. Okay, we use the Bible to interpret the Bible, that's primary. Okay, like we said last week, Bible is divinely inspired. God is the only witness of some of these events, and he is a witness we can rely on. And we have to rely on him. If we're not relying on him, we have to ask ourselves, what are we even doing here? So, looking at this, what does the Bible mean when it says the word day here? Because again, we're getting back to those three different views. Now, the Hebrew word for day is yom. So you might have heard people talk about, what does yom mean, or talking about that when we talk about Genesis. And you may have heard people say that yom doesn't necessarily mean a day. But it can also mean like a period of time, a long period or a short period of time. And it's true that yom isn't always translated as day. However, if we look at the Old Testament, yom is used over 2,200 times. And of those, over 2,000 of those are translated simply as day and are taken as a literal day. Of the 279 other times it is translated, many of them still denote a specific but short period of time. It's just translated as something besides day. For instance, Genesis 39:11, okay? It says, "It came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men in the house there within." And where the phrase that says, "it came to pass about this time," is the word yom is in there as well as a prefix in the Hebrew. So it's talking about about this time is really what it's saying there. And so you could translate it came to pass in those days that this happened. But sometimes that translation isn't always perfect. Okay, and you might also say, well, there's other things that are used to denote a larger time scale, but those always go with the plural word, where in Genesis 1 it's always singular. Here's an example of using the plural. Deuteronomy 5:29. "Oh, that there were such a heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might go well with them and with their children forever." And again, "keep all my commandments always" could be literally translated like all the days. And so again, really we're just taking this word yom, and because we are trying to get the meaning across of what it means, we don't always translate it as day, and that's okay. So we have to be careful of people saying, well, yom isn't always translated as day. Well, yeah, I mean, even when we say, if we talk about like all the days of something, we're not talking about a literal day, we're talking about a span of time. Now, the other objection to this comes actually from a verse just in Genesis chapter 2:4. And 2:4, it says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made the heavens and the earth." And they say, well, creation took over 6 days, so thus using the word day here isn't talking about a literal day, so here's another example where maybe day doesn't always mean day. And yeah, okay, but still talking about a short period of time, and it isn't joined with a number. Now, the other thing I should have said this at the beginning, whenever yom is used with a specific number, like the first day or the second day or 30 days, it's taken literally to mean day. It's always translated as day when there's a number there. Now, what else can tell us more about this day here? Okay, beyond the word itself, what else do we see happening in creation? Now, I only read the first day, but if we look through this, what else do we see happening every day? You see that there's evening and morning. Now, along this line, just keep this in the back of your head, because this actually is important for other parts of Scripture for the Old Testament. Realize that the Hebrew day started in the evening. Okay, sunset actually marked the start of a new day. So Sabbath actually started the night before. That's how we would view it, but it would just be their day. This is one of the reasons why the Pharisees wanted Jesus killed and his body taken off the cross, because evening was about to come and it was about to be the Sabbath, and they didn't want the body up there over the Sabbath. So the Hebrew day starts in the evening. So again, just we'll come back to that later for different passages. But you could also say, well, could evening and morning be taken figuratively? We're just talking about like a start and an end. And I suppose you could. But if we look at all the pieces together, taking it figuratively is very unlikely. And lastly, what we need to do is we need to look at how other parts of Scripture view these events in Genesis 1. So what does the Bible say in other parts about Genesis 1? Well, if we look at Exodus 20, when God's giving the 10 Commandments, when he talks about the Sabbath, this is what he says. He says, "For in 6 days God, or the Lord, made heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So the commandment for the Sabbath is assuming 6 days. It's talking about 6 literal days and a seventh day for rest. It's assuming a literal 6 days of creation and rest on the seventh. And Jesus himself talks about how mankind and things that happened in the beginning of all things. So Mark 10:6, Jesus saying, he says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." So if we're talking about some sort of gap theory or long day theory, we're saying that there's a break between the beginning of creation and Adam and Eve. But Jesus says from the beginning of creation. And then in Luke 11:50 and 51, this is again Jesus talking. He's talking about the blood of the prophets, how people shed their blood often. It says, "So the blood of the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary." And it's talking about from the foundation of the world. If we're talking about Abel being near the beginning of the world, we're not assuming that there's a large time period between creation and Abel. So at this point, we have to ask ourselves, if we're still trying to hold to this long day or gap theory idea, are we trying to look at what the text says, or are we trying to read into the text what we want? And because the only reason I could see that we think it's figurative is because we assume that it's figurative going in, because the text itself and the other parts of the Bible itself look at this as literal days. And so I already talked a bit about gap theory, and yeah, it talks about literal days, but still has the same problems. Now, another thing about gap theory, I'm just going to throw this in here real quick. We said that the word was, the earth was formless and void. Was can be translated as became. But the other parts of the passage where that same verb is used, it's very actively talking about God making something. Or it's very actively talking about, a day passed. It was evening and morning the first day. When God says, let it be that in the first Genesis 1, like where it says, let there be an expanse, or let there be light, let the waters. That is also the same verb that is just translated as was there. So yeah, there is something that's happening, but it's also usually something very active or just, the passage of time, it was a day. So what we could really assume in Genesis 1:2 is that God created the world as formless and void so that he could shape into what he wanted. Now, one other big thing here. Why is this so important? Why does it actually matter if this is a day or a millennia? Well, first of all, we'd have to ask ourselves, there's a few things. There's a few theologies that actually will be broken up when we look at this, if we look at this as a long day creation, or if we look at this as a gap. There's a gap there. And the first question is, why would God be so misleading in his language? Why would he be misleading in Genesis? Because again, this is something that we're divinely inspired. If Yom isn't a single day, then why all the emphasis on the numbers, the morning and evening? It makes God to actually look and be deceptive. And along those same lines, the other passages that look at this would also be being deceptive. And the second thing is that if there was an old earth before Adam and Eve, then what we are saying is that sin isn't the cause of death and pain in this world. Because what we're saying is there's this long earth, and this is how we can look at the fossil record, and this is how we can look at evolution and say that it happened and also God created the world. But for evolution and the fossil record to happen before Adam and Eve, we'd be saying that there's pain, death in this world before sin. And so this lessens the impact of sin and the theology of sin. And so many passages in the Old and New Testament talk about sin being the reason death is here. And so all of those passages would also not be making sense if we are assuming that death was already here before sin. And then third, along those same lines, if before Adam and Eve there was not a perfect world, then our future hope of a sinless world is lessened. Because we're saying, well, there's no sin, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's no pain and suffering. And again, our hope for a future world is saying that our pain and suffering is connected to sin. And we would also be saying that sin and suffering, this is the fourth point, that sin and suffering would be a state that God created the world in. And so if he created in that, and then if he calls that very good, that actually is calling into God's character into question. Because if he's saying sin and pain, or not sin, but pain and death is very good, that calls into question, what is his view on, good and bad. So, and these are only a few points, but they're very key ones. And again, looking at this, other passages that call back on this would also be called into question. Is that literally what Jesus said? Was Jesus wrong? If we're saying that this wasn't 6 days, when Jesus said there was 6 days in creation, we're saying Jesus was wrong. And that's bringing even more theologies into question. Why would God flood the earth because of man if sin was not that bad? Why would Jesus come to die for our sins? And this breaks down even more theologies, and we can keep going on and on, but the real idea here is that the theology of the Bible is founded on the essence of a 6-day creation. If that 6-day creation didn't happen, so many theologies just don't work. Again, this brings a lot of trouble to people, because it's say, well, we're just science deniers now. But like I said before, science isn't these people believe it, so therefore it must be fact type of thing. It's interpreted. And there's actually a lot of Christian ministries out there today that their focus is to view this world and view science through a 6-day creation and explore God's creation that way. And I don't have time to go into them all, but there's 3 of these ministries that I'd encourage you to look up online if you're still curious about this type of stuff, if you want more knowledge. Okay, the first one is Answers in Genesis, and this one was founded more than 20, or at least 20 years ago. I don't know exactly when it was founded, but it's been around for a while. It has lots of good information, some videos on there, lots of good articles. Second one is called the Discovery Institute. I found this one online. It's tied to Michael Behe. I think that's his last name. He was the guy who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and there's other people you might recognize in there. They have a lot of good videos online too, just talking about the complexity of life and that idea. And the third one that I found is called Creation Ministries International. And they're similar to Answers in Genesis. They're just different organization, but all 3 of these are really good. And if you're having questions on something, how does this actually work with the 6-day creation? Those would be some good resources to look at. And if you're having questions and you want me to try and answer some, just let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them. So I'll close with this. The more we discover about science, the more we discover about the world around us, the less likely evolution actually is. And the more we can explain through a 6-day world flood viewpoint. It isn't that science and the Bible conflict, but that men's naturalistic viewpoints in the Bible often conflict. So, when we are looking at these passage here, and not just Genesis 1, but it's against this foundation, so I'm addressing it here. When we look at this, we don't have to say we're either for the Bible or for science. Science is about exploring the universe God created, exploring his creation. But we do have to question some people's viewpoints. And we are good to question that if they disagree with the Bible and say, does this actually work? Or is this some viewpoint that someone made because they didn't want to believe in God, or because they already assumed that God didn't exist? All right, and I'm going to leave it at that for now. Next week we'll get a little more into Genesis 1. We're going to talk a little bit more about the chapter as a whole and about creation itself as a whole. All right, so have a good week, and I will see you next week.